Ethics is the study of moral judgments or value judgments. I always like to think of this little symbol of the Our Lady Justice there with the scales. Picture that when you think of the word ethics from the word ethos, meaning character. So this has to do with that stuff that Socrates always wanted to talk about. How does all of our philosophizing make a difference in our lives? How do we act? How do we comport ourselves? And so in ethics, that is what we're struggling with. Well, uh, it begs the question, what motivates decisions in the first place? And most of us would agree that it comes down to desire. We have desires that we want to fulfill, all kinds of different desires, and that is what wells up within us and gets us to actually have to make decisions as to how we're going to go about satisfying those desires. Well, desires can be good or bad, and as we look at some of the things that, for instance, Epicurus, way back um, BC, right after Aristotle, he suggested that there are different kinds of desires. He doesn't call them good and bad. He calls them natural or unnatural. Now, he's a materialist, so he believes that um, everything is connected materially and things happen for material reasons, and that rather than using terms like good and bad, you just have to recognize that things happen a certain way. And if you can figure out how things happen in the material physical world, then you can understand the way things ought to happen, or what's the best, most advantageous way to make them happen. So he begins by saying we have first a desires that are natural and necessary. In other words, you have those desires because you need them to survive. So, for instance, for food and for shelter, you need these basic things to survive, and so those are good. They are just programmed in by nature. But then there's also the second one, the desires that are natural, yet they're unnecessary desires. You don't need them to survive, like circuses, entertainment, and sex. You don't need them to survive. You won't die without them, but they're nice. They're things that we enjoy. They keep us distracted, keep us thinking. Uh, they keep us from thinking about the fact that we're all just going to die. They keep us living with some sort of sense of equanimity. But according to Epicurus, they aren't necessary. But then the desires we need to be careful over the unnatural and unnecessary both, and that's the excessive things, the superlative things like this bling here, the jewelry and the fancy cars and the rich food and the silk suits and gold pens. These are the things, according to Epicurus, we get carried away with, and they bring more unhappiness than happiness. See, Epicurus felt like the point of life is just to be happy. So figure out what actually brings true happiness and go for it, and avoid anything that might bring you unhappiness. Even might, you see. So this fancy stuff, you lose it and you're really bummed out. But if you never had it to begin with, then you don't have the possibility of that kind of unhappiness. Well, that is sort of the materialist, ancient materialist perspective. Plato, being a rationalist, says, well, you know what we need to do with these desires that we have? We need to use our mind to overcome them. The mind regulates desire. That's why we have it, and that's what we should use it for. Well, there have been 5 traditional ways of trying to figure this all out with our minds, and we're going to go over these 5 common ethical frameworks here. The first being divine command ethics. Divine command ethics appeals to an external authority that says, Here's what's right, here's what's wrong. You don't need to think about it. I'm giving it to you. Your job is just to find a way to do what's being expected of you. Obedience to an external authority. Okay, so divine command. We're not saying divine because it always necessarily comes from God. Anyone whose command that you treat as an authority that's unquestionable is in this category of divine command ethics. So if you follow an ethical standard that is given to you, not figured out by you, but given to you from external to you, and you unquestioningly live your life according to that standard, that's referred to as a divine command ethic. Pretty straightforward. Then there are what we call the deontological, or an easier word for that is duty ethics. So do what is rationally or logically right for human beings. What is your duty as a human being to do? Well, this emanates from the works of Immanuel Kant, who had certain assumptions about what it means to be a human being. Only human beings are capable of rationality, and as rational, only human beings are autonomous, meaning only human beings can self-reflect and decide what they are going to do. And so only human beings can be judged for their intentions. And so he says, make your intentions to do what is your duty as a human being. Then there is virtue ethics. This would be the ethics of our classical philosophers, Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. Do what is humanly best. Set a standard of being the best that you can be. Not simply looking at what we do, but what we should do. What should we do in order to be the best that human beings can be? Guide yourself according to a standard like that. So Plato says the secret to it is balance and moderation. More on that in another video. Then there is consequentialism or utilitarianism, which, when you look at these words, kind of explains what this is about. Look at any given action and look at the consequence and decide if it's good or bad based on the consequences of the action, the results. Do what causes the best results. And by utilitarianism, I mean, what is the utility? What is the usefulness of that action? So you have to speculate as to what might be the results of any given ethical decision, and then go with the one that produces what? Well, produces the greatest good for the greatest amount of people. That famous little maxim that we get from Jeremy Bentham. Well, then there's relativism, which says do what is right for the situation. Don't appeal to any kind of moral absolutes, but rather size up the situation, and depending on your given perspective at any given time and place, you would decide what is best. Well, that would have to also take into account cultural relativism. Your very culture might dictate what is beautiful, what is best, what is advantageous. So you have to appeal to a source not quite as wide as being anywhere, but taking into account the specificities of a cultural situation. And then, of course, there's even tighter look, a personal subjectivist relativism that says do what your conscience tells you to do. You yourself as an individual have to decide in any given situation. So those are the 5 most common ethical frameworks, and in later videos we will develop them in more detail.